In the heart of Chicago, where the wind howled between tall buildings and streetlights flickered like tired eyes, there was a small piano bar tucked away on a side street most tourists never found. It wasn't fancy, just a narrow space with dark wood walls, a few round tables, and a bar that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and old whiskey. The place was called the Velvet Note, though no one remembered why. Maybe it was the deep red curtains that framed the windows, or maybe it was the soft hum of conversation that filled the room on quiet nights. Either way, it wasn't the kind of spot that drew crowds. Most evenings, only a handful of regulars showed up. Retired teachers, night shift nurses, a few lonely souls looking for a drink and a little background noise to drown out their thoughts. Behind the bar, wiping glasses with a faded towel, was a man named Leo who'd worked there longer than anyone could remember. He moved slowly, spoke even slower, and had a habit of humming old jazz tunes under his breath while he polished wine glasses. At the tables, a young woman named Leora Chen moved with quiet efficiency, balancing trays of drinks and plates of charcuterie with the kind of grace that came from doing the same thing over and over, until it became second nature. She wore a black apron over a simple blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail, and her eyes, deep brown and always slightly tired, never lingered too long on any one person. She smiled when needed, nodded politely, and vanished into the kitchen or behind the bar whenever she could. To most customers, she was just part of the furniture, present, useful, but forgettable. What no one knew, not Leo, not the regulars, not even the bar's owner, was that Leora had once been something else entirely. Years ago, before the weight of life pressed down on her shoulders, she'd sat on concert stages in front of hundreds, her fingers dancing across piano keys with a precision and emotion that left audiences breathless. She'd been accepted into Juilliard's pre-college division at 14, the youngest in her class. Teachers whispered that she had the hands of a poet and the soul of a storm. Her father, a quiet engineer with a love for classical music, used to sit in the front row of every recital, eyes shining with pride he never voiced aloud. He'd saved for years to buy her a baby grand piano, a dream they both cherished. But dreams, as Leora learned too soon, don't pay hospital bills. When her father was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, everything changed. His hands, once steady enough to fix radios and build model airplanes, began to tremble uncontrollably. He lost his job, then their savings, then the house. Leora dropped out of Juilliard halfway through her second year, packed what little she could carry, and moved back home to care for him. She took whatever work she could find, dishwasher, cashier, overnight stalker, until she landed at the Velvet Note. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were flexible, and the owner didn't ask questions. Most importantly, the bar had a piano. An old Steinway, slightly out of tune, covered in a layer of dust, sitting in the far corner like a forgotten guest. Leora would glance at it sometimes when she passed by, her chest tightening in a way she couldn't explain. But she never touched it. Not once until the night Darian Thorne walked in. He didn't look like the usual crowd. For one, he wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Leora made in 3 months. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He sat alone at a corner table, ordered a glass of single malt scotch, neat, and scanned the room with sharp, assessing eyes. He wasn't there to relax. He was scouting locations for a private event his foundation was hosting. Something elegant but understated. The Velvet Note had been recommended by an assistant who thought the vintage vibe might appeal to his aesthetic. Leora approached his table with her notepad, keeping her voice neutral. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked up at her, not at her face but at her hands. They were clean but rough from dishwater and constant wiping. "You work here long?" he asked, his tone casual but direct. "Long enough," she replied, already stepping back. He nodded, then gestured toward the piano. "Does anyone ever play that thing?" "Not really," she said. "It's more for show." "Shame," he said, swirling his drink. "It's a Steinway, probably worth more than this whole block." Leora didn't respond. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Can you play?" The question hit her like a cold splash of water. She froze, then shook her head quickly. "No, I just serve drinks." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read something beneath her words. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He peeled off a $100 bill and placed it on the table. Play one song, anything, I'll double your tip for the night. Leora's stomach dropped. I really can't, she said, her voice firmer now. I haven't played in years. 7 years, 3 months, he said quietly. She blinked. What? He leaned forward slightly. Your name's Leora Chen. You left Juilliard in your 2nd year. Your last public performance was at the Merkin Hall recital in March 2018. You played Liszt's Liebesträume. I looked you up after I saw your name on the staff roster. Leora's breath caught. She hadn't realized her name was even listed anywhere. Why would you do that? Because I'm curious, he said. And because I don't believe someone with your background just stops. She felt exposed, like he'd pulled back a curtain she'd carefully drawn years ago. Anger flared in her chest, mixed with shame. My life isn't your curiosity, she said, voice low. He didn't flinch. Instead, he placed another bill on the table, another 100. One song. Or I buy this place tomorrow and shut it down. I'll tell the owner your attitude cost everyone their jobs. It wasn't a bluff. She could see it in his eyes. He meant it. And worse, he could do it. Men like him didn't make idle threats. For a long moment, she stood there, heart pounding. She thought of Leo, who'd been kind to her from day one. She thought of the dishwasher in the back, a single mother working double shifts. She thought of her father, who depended on her paycheck for his medication. Slowly, she untied her apron and laid it on a nearby chair. Without a word, she walked to the piano. The room had gone quiet. A few customers had noticed the exchange and were watching. Leo paused mid-wipe, his humming silenced. Even the soft jazz playing from the speakers seemed to fade into the background. Leora lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed with age, a few chipped at the edges. She ran her fingers lightly over them, feeling the familiar shape, the slight resistance. It was like meeting an old friend you hadn't seen in decades. Awkward at first, then achingly familiar. She didn't choose a flashy piece. No Liszt, no Rachmaninoff. Instead, she placed her hands gently on the keys and began to play Clair de Lune by Debussy, the same piece she'd played for her father the night before he was admitted to long-term care. The night he'd held her hand and whispered, Don't stop playing it, Maymay. The world needs your music. At first, her fingers were stiff. The timing was off. But then something shifted. Memory took over. Muscle, emotion, years of practice, all of it flooded back in a single breath. The music filled the room, soft at first, then swelling with quiet power. It wasn't perfect. There were missed notes, moments of hesitation. But what came through wasn't technical skill, it was feeling. Every note carried the weight of everything she'd lost, everything she'd buried, everything she still carried inside. People stopped talking. A couple at the bar forgot their drinks. A man near the window lowered his newspaper. Even the street noise outside seemed to hush, as if the city itself was listening. Darian sat perfectly still, his glass untouched. He'd expected competence, maybe even talent. But this was something else. It was raw, human, real. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't name. When the final note faded into silence, no one moved. 3 full seconds passed before someone clapped, softly at first, then louder until the whole room was applauding. Leora didn't stand or bow. She simply closed the piano lid, stood up, and walked back to her apron. She tied it around her waist, picked up her tray, and returned to the bar as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Darian watched her go, his mind racing. He'd come looking for a venue. Instead, he'd stumbled upon a story, one that didn't fit into his world of spreadsheets, acquisitions, and calculated risks. He finished his drink in one slow sip, left a generous tip, far more than promised, and walked out into the Chicago night. But he didn't forget. Back at his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, he sat at his desk long after midnight. He pulled up every article, every recording, every scrap of information about Leora Chen he could find. There wasn't much, just a few old recital programs, a blurry photo from a student showcase, a mention in a Juilliard newsletter. But it was enough. He saw the potential, the tragedy, the waste, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, even to himself, he decided he wasn't going to let it end there. The next morning, before the bar even opened, he returned. He didn't go inside. Instead, he slipped an envelope under the door. Inside was a handwritten note on thick cream-colored paper. Leora, You owe the world more than dirty dishes. I'm offering you a stage, not an audience. Just you, a piano, and the music you were meant to share. No cameras. No press, no strings. Think about it. D. He didn't sign his last name. He didn't need to. Inside the bar, Leo found the envelope and handed it to Leora during her morning shift. She read it once, then again, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to crumple it up. To throw it away? To pretend last night never happened. But as she stood behind the bar, wiping the same glass over and over, she kept hearing the echo of those notes, the way they'd filled the room, the way they'd made her feel just for a moment, like herself again. And deep down, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the years of silence, a tiny spark refused to go out. Leora didn't open the envelope right away. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron and went about her shift like nothing had happened. But the weight of it pressed against her hip all evening, a quiet reminder of something she'd spent years trying to forget. When she finally got home past midnight, her feet aching, her back stiff from carrying trays, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at the envelope for a long time. The apartment was small, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. Her father's photo sat on the nightstand, framed in cheap plastic but kept spotless. She traced the edge of the frame with her thumb before finally tearing open the note. She read it once, then again, then a third time as if the words might change. You owe the world more than dirty dishes. The sentence stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She told herself for years that stepping away from music was the right thing to do, that caring for her father mattered more than personal dreams. And it did, but somewhere along the way, she'd stopped believing she deserved anything for herself. Not joy, not beauty, not even a moment at the piano without guilt whispering in her ear. She almost threw the note away. Almost. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the hum of the city outside her window, she couldn't stop hearing the sound of her own playing, the way the notes had flowed, the way her chest had opened up like it used to when she was a girl lost in a Chopin nocturne. It had been years since she'd felt that kind of freedom. And though fear coiled in her stomach at the thought of stepping back into that world, a quieter voice inside her whispered, "What if you try? Just once?" 3 days later, she sent a single text to the number Darian had included at the bottom of the note. No greeting, no explanation. Just 2 words. I'm in. She expected a flurry of calls, a barrage of instructions, maybe even a contract. Instead, she got a simple reply. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Arts Wing, 3rd floor. Door will be unlocked. The next morning, she stood outside a sleek glass building in the Gold Coast neighborhood, heart pounding. The entrance was unmarked, no sign, just a keypad and a camera. She punched in the code he'd texted her and stepped inside. The elevator opened directly into a sunlit space unlike anything she'd ever seen. High ceilings, white walls, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake. In the center of the room sat a gleaming black Steinway, new, perfectly tuned, surrounded by silence. Darian was there, but not in the way she expected. He wasn't dressed in a suit. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a soft-looking sweater, standing near a coffee machine with 2 mugs in hand. He didn't greet her with a handshake or a grand speech. He just nodded and handed her a cup. Black, right? She blinked. How did you... I asked Leo. He said you drink it like water. She took the mug, warmth seeping into her palms. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Darian gestured to the piano. No pressure, just sit, see how it feels. She hesitated, then walked over. The bench was perfectly adjusted to her height. Someone had measured it. She sat, placed her hands above the keys, and froze. The blankness returned, the fear. What if she couldn't do it anymore? What if last time was a fluke? Darian must have seen it in her face. You don't have to play, he said gently. Just be here, so she stayed. She ran her fingers over the keys without pressing down. She listened to the quiet hum of the building, the distant sound of traffic, the soft clink of Darian setting his mug down. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed. On the second day, she played a scale. Just C major up and down. Her fingers fumbled at first, but by the 5th try, muscle memory kicked in. On the 3rd day, she played a short Bach prelude, halting, uncertain, but complete. Darian never interrupted. He never offered praise or criticism. He just sat in a chair by the window, reading or working on his laptop, present but never intrusive. By the end of the first week, something shifted. She began arriving earlier. She stayed later. She started bringing sheet music, old pieces she'd loved as a teenager, ones she'd marked up with pencil notes in the margins. One afternoon, without thinking, she played Clair de Lune again. This time it was smoother, more controlled, but it lacked the raw ache of that night at the bar. She stopped halfway through, frustrated. "It's not the same," she muttered. Darian looked up from his book. "It's not supposed to be," she turned to him. "What do you mean?" "That night," he said carefully, "you weren't playing for an audience. You weren't playing to impress. You were playing because you had to. Because the music was the only place you could put everything you couldn't say out loud." He paused. "Don't try to recreate that. Just find your way back to why you loved it in the first place." His words stayed with her. That evening, instead of practicing a recital piece, she sat at the piano and played a simple lullaby her grandmother used to hum. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't difficult. But it made her eyes sting. Over the next few weeks, Darian arranged for small things that made a difference. A heating pad for her stiff shoulders, a footrest that adjusted to her height, even a quiet space in the building where she could take breaks without being disturbed. He also did something unexpected. He brought in Ems, Lara Voss, her old Juilliard mentor, now retired and living in Wisconsin. Leora hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. The reunion was emotional. Ms. Voss, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, took one look at Leora and pulled her into a hug that lasted a full minute. "I knew you'd come back," she said, voice thick. "Talent like yours doesn't just disappear. It just goes quiet for a while." Under Ms. Voss's guidance, Leora's playing deepened. Not just technically, though her finger strength and timing improved, but emotionally. She learned to listen to the spaces between the notes, to let silence speak as loudly as sound. Ms. Voss never pushed her toward virtuosic showpieces. Instead, she encouraged her to explore pieces that resonated with her life now, music that carried sorrow, resilience, hope. Meanwhile, Darian remained a steady presence. He never asked about her father, never pried into her past. But one rainy afternoon, as they sat in the lounge after a long rehearsal, he surprised her by saying, "I grew up in a house with no music. No laughter, really. Just contracts, expectations, and silence." He stirred his coffee slowly. "My father believed emotions were weaknesses, so I learned to hide mine, built a life out of logic, numbers, control." He looked at her. "Hearing you play, it's like hearing someone speak a language I forgot existed." Leora didn't know what to say. She'd assumed he was just another rich man playing at being a patron of the arts. But in that moment, she saw something else, a loneliness that mirrored her own, just wrapped in different packaging. As the weeks turned into months, the idea of a private concert began to take shape. Darian proposed a small event. 20 guests, all people who loved music but weren't part of the industry. No press, no recordings, just an evening of listening. Leora agreed, but only if she could choose the program herself. She spent days agonizing over the set list. She wanted it to tell a story not of triumph but of return. She included Debussy, yes, but also a haunting piece by Florence Price, a composer long overlooked because of her race and gender. She added a short work by a contemporary Ukrainian pianist whose music spoke of loss and home. And at the center of it all, she wrote something of her own, a short composition she'd been sketching in notebooks for years titled "For Dad." It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was honest. Rehearsals grew more intense. There were days she left the arts wing in tears, convinced she wasn't ready. Days when her hands cramped, when her mind went blank, when the weight of expectation, her own mostly, felt unbearable. On one particularly hard day, she slammed the piano lid shut and said, "I can't do this. I'm not who I was." Darian didn't argue. He just handed her a coat. "Come on." He drove her to the lakefront, parked near a quiet stretch of path, and they walked in silence as the sun set over the water. The wind was cold, but the sky was clear, streaked with pink and gold. After a while, he said, "You don't have to be who you were. You just have to be who you are now, and that's enough." She didn't answer. But the next morning, she was back at the piano before anyone else arrived. The night before the concert, she visited her father at the care facility. He was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the courtyard. He didn't speak much these days, but he still recognized her. She sat beside him and held his hand, its tremor softer now thanks to new medication she could finally afford. She didn't tell him about the concert. She just said, "I played today. It felt good." He turned his head slowly and gave her the faintest smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Back at her apartment, she laid out the simple black dress she'd bought secondhand. She checked her sheet music one last time. She practiced her breathing just like Ms. Voss had taught her. And when sleep wouldn't come, she sat by the window and listened to the city, letting the hum of it calm her nerves. The next evening, she arrived at Darian's private library, a converted space lined with books, warm wood, and soft lighting. The Steinway stood in the center, bathed in amber light. 20 chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle. No stage, no spotlight, just intimacy. As the guests arrived, quietly, respectfully, Leora waited in a side room, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't nervous in the way she used to be before recitals. There was no dread, no panic, just a deep, steady focus. She thought of her father's smile, of Ms. Voss's quiet faith, of Darian, who'd given her space to return without demanding anything in return. When it was time, she walked out. No announcement. No fanfare. She simply sat at the piano, took a breath, and began. The first notes of Debussy filled the room like a sigh. And this time there was no hesitation, no fear, just music, clear, true, and full of everything she'd carried for so long. By the time she reached for Dad, even Darian had tears in his eyes, and in that room, for one perfect evening, Leora wasn't a waitress, a caregiver, or a ghost from a lost past. She was exactly who she was meant to be, a woman with a story to tell and the courage to tell it through song. The morning after the concert, Leora woke up to silence. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the quiet hum of something settled, like the air after a storm has passed. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night in her mind. Not the applause, not the guests' hushed whispers afterward, but the feeling in her hands as they moved across the keys. It had been years since music felt like breathing instead of work. She expected Darian to call, to gush, to propose a tour, to hand her a contract thick with promises, but her phone stayed quiet. No texts, no emails, just a single voicemail from Leo at the bar. "Hey kid, heard you played last night. Proud of you. Your usual shift's open if you want it." That small gesture, no questions, no pressure, meant more than she could say. 3 days passed before Darian reached out. He didn't call. He showed up at her apartment building just after sunset, standing under the flickering street lamp with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked tired but calm. "Can we walk?" he asked. She nodded and grabbed her jacket. They didn't talk at first. They just walked through the neighborhood, past shuttered storefronts and glowing apartment windows, the kind of streets that felt alive even in the cold. Finally, Darian said, "Last night, I've been to hundreds of concerts. Galas, premieres, private recitals in palaces, but I've never heard anything like that." Leora kept her eyes on the sidewalk. "It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be," he said. "It was real. And that's rare." She glanced at him. "Why did you do it? All of it, the space, Ms. Voss, the concert? You didn't have to." He stopped walking and faced her. "Because I saw something in you that reminded me of what I've been missing. Not talent, humanity." He paused. "You play like you've lived. And most people, even the famous ones, play like they're trying to escape." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded. They walked a little farther. Then he said, "I have an offer. Not a demand. Just an offer." She tensed slightly. "Okay. I'll fund a small tour. 10 cities, intimate venues, no media. You pick the music, the dates, the team. All I ask is that you consider sharing your gift beyond last night's room." She shook her head before he even finished. "I don't want that life. The spotlight, the interviews, the pressure. I'd lose myself again. I'm not asking you to become a star," he said gently. "I'm asking you to keep playing. On your terms." She thought about it. Really thought. But the image of airport lines, dressing rooms, strangers dissecting her performance, it made her chest tighten. "No," she said finally, "but thank you." He didn't argue, didn't push, just said, "Fair enough." They stood there for a moment in the quiet street. Then, almost shyly, he added, "There is one other thing." She raised an eyebrow. "A community center downtown. They run after-school programs for kids from low-income families. Their piano teacher retired last month. They've been using a keyboard with half the keys missing." He looked at her. "They asked if you'd consider teaching a few hours a week. Just weekends. No auditions, no expectations. Just kids who've never touched a real piano. Leora's breath caught. She hadn't considered teaching. She'd always thought of performance as the only path. But the idea of guiding someone else's first notes, the wonder in their eyes when they played their first scale, felt different. Meaningful in a way fame never had. When would it start? She asked. Whenever you're ready. She didn't say yes right away, but that night she dreamed of small hands on ivory keys, clumsy but eager. A week later, she walked into the Moharmony Lane Community Center, a converted warehouse with peeling paint and mismatched chairs. The director, a warm woman named Nia with silver braids and a laugh that filled the room, showed her to the music room. In the corner sat a battered upright piano, its wood scratched, one pedal loose. But it worked. The first Saturday, only 3 kids showed up, 2 boys and a girl, all between 8 and 10. They stared at her like she was a ghost. "You really played for a billionaire?" One of the boys asked, eyes wide. She smiled. "I played for myself. He just happened to be listening." She didn't start with scales or theory. She asked them what music made them feel. One said happy, another said like running. The girl said like my grandma's soup. So Leora taught them to find those feelings on the keys. She showed them how to make a melody that sounded like laughter, how to play softly like a secret. It wasn't glamorous. Some days the kids forgot their sheet music. Others argued over who got to play first. Once a boy spilled juice on the piano bench. But slowly something beautiful grew. The girl, Mira, started humming little tunes she made up. One of the boys, Tavian, practiced so much his mother called to thank Leora. He hasn't touched his video games in 2 weeks. Leora found herself looking forward to Saturdays more than anything. Teaching forced her to listen differently, not just to the notes but to the person behind them. She began to see music not as a performance to perfect, but as a language anyone could learn if given the chance. Meanwhile, life at the Velvet Note changed. She still worked a few shifts a week, not because she needed the money as much now. Darian had quietly increased her stipend from the concert, calling it a consulting fee, but because she liked the rhythm of it. Leo treated her the same as always, though he'd sometimes leave a cup of tea on the piano when he thought she might need a break. Then, something unexpected happened. A grainy audio clip, just 47 seconds of her playing Claire de Lune at the bar, surfaced online. No video, no name, just the sound uploaded to a classical music forum with the caption, "Heard this in a Chicago bar. Who is this pianist?" It spread quietly at first. Among musicians, teachers, lovers of piano music, someone recognized the phrasing, the subtle rubato, and dug up her old Juilliard records. Within weeks, her name was whispered in corners of the classical world. A small indie label reached out. A documentary filmmaker sent a polite email. A European festival invited her to perform. Leora deleted the emails, ignored the calls, but one message gave her pause. It was from a music therapist working with children who had experienced trauma. She'd heard the clip and wrote, "Your playing carries a kind of gentleness that speaks to broken places. Would you ever consider collaborating on a project for kids who can't find words?" Leora read it 3 times. Then she replied, "Tell me more." She didn't commit to anything, but she started thinking differently about her music, not as something to hide or showcase, but as something that could heal. One afternoon, while cleaning up after a lesson, Mira lingered behind. "Miss Leora," she said shyly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you stop playing for so long?" Leora sat on the edge of the piano bench. "Because life got hard, and I thought I had to choose between taking care of people I love and doing what I love." "Did you have to?" Leora looked at the girl's earnest face and realized the answer had changed. "No," she said softly. "I didn't." That night she called Darian. He answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" "I want to do something," she said. "Not a tour, not fame, but more than just weekends." He listened as she described her idea, a series of free community concerts in libraries, shelters, even hospitals. Small performances paired with short workshops for anyone who wanted to try. No tickets, no press, just music offered like a hand reaching out. "I'll need a decent piano," she added, "and maybe someone to help with logistics." "I'll handle it," he said without hesitation. "You focus on the music." True to his word, within a week, a beautiful Yamaha upright appeared at the community center, donated anonymously. The paperwork signed only with the initials DT. Nia cried when she saw it. The first community concert was held in the basement of a public library on the south side. Only 15 people came, mostly parents with young kids, a few elderly neighbors, a social worker on her break. Leora played for 30 minutes, then invited anyone to come up and try the piano. A shy boy played Mary Had a Little Lamb. An older woman, hands trembling with arthritis, pressed a single key and smiled like she'd unlocked a memory. Afterward, a woman approached her. "My daughter hasn't spoken since the fire," she said quietly. "But she sat through your whole performance. Didn't move once." She squeezed Leora's hand. "Thank you." Leora went home that night and wrote a new piece. Short, simple, full of space. She called it, "For the Ones Who Listen." As the weeks passed, the concerts grew, not in size, but in meaning. She played in a women's shelter, in a youth center, even in the garden of a hospice where an old man with oxygen tubes tapped his foot to a Chopin waltz. Each place taught her something new about why music matters, not for perfection, but for connection. Darian attended everyone, always sitting in the back, never drawing attention. Sometimes they'd grab coffee afterward and he'd ask gentle questions. "What moved you tonight? Did you see the little girl in the red shoes? She cried during the Debussy." He never took credit. Never made it about his generosity. He just showed up. One rainy evening, after a concert at a community church, Leora found him waiting under the awning. "You're getting better," he said. "At what?" "At letting people in." She looked down at her wet shoes. "I'm still learning." He handed her an umbrella. "Good, so am I." Back at her apartment, she checked her phone. A message from her father's caregiver. He hummed a tune today. Couldn't place it, but he seemed peaceful. She knew the tune. It was the opening phrase of "For Dad." She sat by the window, listening to the rain, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was choosing between her past and her present. She was weaving them together, one note, one lesson, one quiet act of courage at a time. And in that space, she finally felt whole. The community concerts became a quiet rhythm in Leora's life, like breathing, like walking, like the steady beat of a metronome she no longer needed but still felt inside her. She played in places most musicians never saw: a basement rec room at a halfway house, a sunlit atrium in a children's hospital, even the back patio of a food pantry during a summer heat wave. She never announced them on social media. There were no posters, no ticket sales. Word spread the old-fashioned way, through neighbors, teachers, nurses, the kind of people who knew who needed beauty the most. Darian handled the logistics without fanfare. He'd text her a location and time, arrange for a piano to be delivered, make sure the space was warm in winter and cool in summer. He never took a seat in the front row. He preferred the back near the door, where he could slip out unnoticed if someone needed space. Sometimes, after the last note faded and the small crowd had drifted away, he'd find her packing up her sheet music and say only, "You reached them," before handing her a thermos of tea he'd brought just in case. But even in the quietest corners, ripples form. One afternoon, while teaching Mira how to shape a melody with dynamics, "Softer here, like you're telling a secret," Nia knocked on the music room door. She held a tablet in her hand, her expression unreadable. "Leora," she said gently. "Someone posted a video." Leora's stomach dropped. "What kind of video?" "Just 30 seconds. From the library concert last week. No face, just your hands and the piano, but it's been shared a lot." Leora followed her to the office and watched the clip. It was shaky, filmed on a phone, but the audio was clear. She was playing a short improvisation, something she'd made up on the spot after a little boy asked if she could play something that sounds like stars. The camera panned only to her hands, moving with calm certainty over the keys. At the end, a child's voice whispered, "Wow." The caption read, "This woman plays like she's healing the world one note at a time. Anyone know who she is?" Below it, hundreds of comments. "This brought me to tears. Where can I hear more?" This is what music is supposed to feel like. Leora felt a familiar panic rise in her chest, the same fear that had kept her away from pianos for years. "Take it down," she said quickly. "Please," Nia hesitated. "I can ask, but it's been reposted on 3 other platforms. It's out of our hands." That night, Leora barely slept. She imagined headlines, interviews. Strangers showing up at the community center with cameras. She thought about her father, safe in his routine, and worried the attention might somehow find him. She even considered quitting the concerts altogether. But the next morning, as she walked to the center, she passed a bus stop where two teenagers were listening to music through shared earbuds. One of them looked up as she passed and said, "Hey, are you the piano lady?" Her heart jumped, but the girl just smiled. "My mom showed me that video, said it helped her sleep for the first time in weeks." She paused. "Thank you." There was no demand, no intrusion, just gratitude. That small moment changed something in Leora. Maybe the world didn't want to consume her. Maybe it just needed to hear. She called Darian that afternoon. "I'm not running," she said, "but I need to set boundaries." He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Let me help you protect your peace." Together, they drafted a simple statement, short, clear, posted only on the community center's website. Leora Chen shares music in community spaces as a gift, not a performance. She does not give interviews, accept commercial offers, or appear on social media. If you've been moved by her playing, the best way to honor it is to listen deeply and to pass kindness forward. They didn't send it to news outlets. They didn't tag anyone. They just put it out there like leaving a note on a park bench. To their surprise, it worked. The music blogs that had been digging for her story paused. A few respectful articles appeared. The pianist who plays for no one and everyone. But they quoted only the statement and focused on the impact of her work, not her personal life. Record labels backed off. The documentary filmmaker wrote back, "I understand. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here, with no cameras, just conversation." Meanwhile, the concerts continued, and something unexpected began to happen. People started bringing their own music. At a shelter for unhoused families, a teenage girl played a song she'd written about missing her dog. At a senior center, a retired postal worker tapped out a tune his grandfather used to whistle. Leora would listen, then gently help them shape it, add a bass line, smooth a rhythm, find the heart of it. The concerts became less about her and more about shared space, shared sound. One Saturday, after a session at the youth center, Tavi stayed behind. He'd grown taller, his voice deeper, but his eyes still lit up when he talked about chords. "Miss Leora," he said, shuffling his feet, "I wrote something. It's not good, but do you want to hear it?" She sat beside him on the bench. He played a short piece, clumsy in places but full of longing. It reminded her of rain on a tin roof. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. He grinned. "I called it Waiting for Spring." She nodded. "Then let's play it together." They did. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just teaching piano. She was helping others find their voice. Back at her apartment that evening, she found a package by her door. No return address. Inside was a hard-covered journal, blank pages, and a note in Darian's neat handwriting. "For the songs you haven't written yet." She opened it that night and began to compose. Not for an audience. Not for a stage, but for the quiet joy of creation. She wrote a piece for Mira's birthday. One for the hospice nurse who'd held her father's hand during a bad night. One for the rainy afternoon when Tavi finally nailed his first arpeggio. She didn't know it yet, but those pieces would become something bigger. A few weeks later, Nia approached her with an idea. "There's a grant," she said carefully, "for community arts projects. It's small, but it could fund a weekly music circle, open to anyone, any age, any skill. You'd lead it, but it wouldn't be just you performing. It'd be collaborative." Leora thought about it. "What if no one comes?" "Then it's just you and me humming," Nia said with a laugh. "But I think they'll come," they applied. And to everyone's surprise, they got the grant. The first Harmony Circle met on a Tuesday evening in the center's main hall. 7 people showed up. A grandmother, a college student, a man who'd lost his job, 2 kids from the after-school program, and a quiet woman who sat in the back and didn't speak. Leora didn't teach. She invited. "What sound lives in you today?" she asked. The grandmother sang a lullaby from her childhood in Ghana. The college student played a few chords on a borrowed guitar. The quiet woman finally whispered, "I used to play flute, before my hands got stiff." So Leora found an old flute in the storage closet, and with gentle guidance, the woman played a single, trembling note. Tears rolled down her cheeks. No one said a word. They just listened. By the third week, the circle had grown to 15. By the fifth, they were writing songs together, simple, honest things about hope, loss, waiting, joy. Darian came once, just to drop off extra chairs. He stood in the doorway for a few minutes, watching. Later, he texted Leora, "You're not just playing piano. You're building a home." She didn't reply, but she saved the message. One evening after the circle ended, she stayed late to practice. The new pieces were coming faster now, melodies that felt like conversations. She played one she'd just finished, a gentle waltz she'd titled, "For the Ones Who Stay." It was for the caregivers, the teachers, the quiet heroes who show up day after day without applause. Unbeknownst to her, Darian hadn't left. He'd been sitting in the hallway listening through the open door. When she finished, he stepped inside. "That one," he said softly, "is your best yet." She smiled. "It's not for an audience. Maybe not," he said. "But it's for someone. And that's enough." She looked at him, really looked. She saw the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders had softened over the months, the absence of the cold certainty he'd carried when they first met. He wasn't just funding her music anymore. He was part of it. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not trying to own it," he nodded. "Some things aren't meant to be owned, just witnessed." That night, as she walked home under a sky full of stars, she didn't feel fear. She didn't feel pressure. She felt enough. Not because she'd been discovered, not because she'd achieved anything grand, but because she'd found a way to share her gift without losing herself. And in a world that often demanded performance over presence, that was its own kind of miracle. Time didn't stop for Leora, but it did soften. The sharp edges of worry, the fear of being seen, the guilt of wanting something for herself began to wear down like river stones, smoothed by the steady current of small, meaningful days. She still taught at the community center every weekend. The Harmony Circle now met twice a week and had its own little shelf of handmade songbooks, filled with lyrics and melodies written by people who once thought they had nothing to offer. Mira, now 11, had started composing short piano pieces of her own. Tavi played in a school jazz ensemble and sometimes brought his trumpet to the circle, blending brass warmth with Leora's piano like they'd been making music together forever. Leora no longer waited tables at the Velvet Note, but she visited often. Leo always saved her a seat near the piano, and sometimes on slow nights she'd play a single piece, just for him, just for the quiet joy of it. The old Steinway had been tuned, its dust long gone, and though it wasn't a concert grand, it held its own kind of dignity. People came not for spectacle, but for the rare chance to hear music that felt like a conversation, not a performance. Darian remained a quiet presence in her life, not a savior, not a patron, just a friend who showed up. He still funded the piano deliveries, still handled the logistics of the community concerts, but he never took credit. He'd sit in the back of the room, sometimes with a notebook, jotting down ideas for his foundation. Over time, the foundation shifted its focus. Instead of funding flashy galas, it began supporting overlooked artists, music teachers in rural towns, poets working with refugees, muralists painting on abandoned buildings. Leora's story, shared only in private meetings and grant proposals, became a quiet blueprint. Art doesn't need an audience to matter. It needs a home. One spring afternoon, Leora received a call from her father's care facility. Not an emergency, just an invitation. "He's been humming again," the nurse said. "And he keeps pointing to the piano in the common room. Would you maybe play for him? Just you and him." She went that evening. The facility was quiet, bathed in golden light from the setting sun. Her father sat in his usual chair by the window, wrapped in a soft blanket. He didn't speak much these days, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. She kissed his forehead, then walked to the old upright piano in the corner, out of tune, missing a key but playable. She didn't choose a grand piece. She played For Dad. The short composition she'd written years ago, the one that held all her love, all her grief, all her gratitude. As her fingers moved, she watched him. His hands, once so steady, now trembled slightly, but in time with the music. When she finished, he didn't clap. He just reached for her hand and held it, his thumb brushing her knuckles the way he used to when she was a little girl. That night, she went home and wrote a new piece. She called it The Way Back. A few weeks later, the community center hosted its first annual Neighbors Recital, a low-key event where anyone from the Harmony Circle could share a song, a poem, or even a silence if that's what they needed. Mira played her latest composition, a bright skipping tune she'd titled Rain Boots and Puddles. Tavi performed a jazz standard with a confidence that made Leora's heart swell. The quiet woman who'd played the flute months ago sang a folk song from her childhood, her voice thin but true. Leora didn't perform. She sat in the front row, listening, smiling, sometimes wiping her eyes. Afterward, as people milled about with cups of cider and homemade cookies, Nia pulled her aside. "You know," Nia said, "you've changed this place. Not just with music, with permission. You showed people it's okay to be tender, to try to be imperfect." Leora shook her head. "I didn't do anything special." "You showed up," Nia said simply. "And you let others show up too." Later that evening, as she locked up the center, she found a large envelope taped to the piano. Inside was a deed of ownership, not for a building but for the Yamaha upright that had become the heart of their music room. The paperwork was signed, the donation finalized. At the bottom, in familiar handwriting, was a note. "For the kids. And for you. D." She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the piano lid, tears welling. It wasn't about the instrument. It was about permanence, about saying, "This matters. You matter. Stay." She didn't see Darian for several days after that. When she finally called, his assistant answered. "He's away for a bit," she said gently. "But he left something for you." The next morning, a courier delivered a small wooden box to her apartment. Inside was a vintage record player and a single vinyl LP. No label, no title, just a handwritten track list on the sleeve. She placed the needle on the groove and heard it immediately, her own playing. Not from a concert, not from a studio, but from that very first night at the Velvet Note. The 47 seconds of Claire de Lune that had slipped into the world without her permission, but now preserved, not for strangers but for her. On the back of the sleeve, Darian had written, "Sometimes the first note is the bravest. Never forget that." She played it once, then sat by the window as the city hummed below. She thought of all the places her music had gone, not stages or screens, but hospital rooms, shelter basements, the quiet corners of people's hearts. She hadn't become famous. She hadn't toured the world. But in a dozen young hands learning their first scales, in the hum of a neighborhood that now had music where there was none, her song lived on, not as a spectacle, but as a gift. Months passed. Seasons turned. The Harmony Circle grew. A local high school asked Leora to mentor their music students once a month. She said yes, but only if they also visited the community center to play for others. "Music isn't just about getting better," she told them. "It's about giving it away." One rainy November evening, she returned to the Velvet Note for the first time in months. Leah was behind the bar, humming as always. The room was nearly empty, just a couple in the corner and a man reading by the window. She sat at the piano, not because anyone asked, but because the rain outside matched the mood of a new piece she'd been working on. Something about letting go, about trust, about the quiet courage of showing up again and again. She played softly, so as not to disturb, but the couple stopped talking. The reader lowered his book. Leo leaned against the bar, eyes closed, a small smile on his face. When she finished, the man by the window stood up. He walked over, placed a $20 bill on the piano, and said, "My wife loved piano. She passed last year. That sounded like her favorite time of day. Early morning, just after sunrise." He paused. "Thank you for that memory." Leora nodded, throat tight. "You're welcome." He left without another word, but the space he left behind felt full. Later, as she walked home through the glistening streets, she passed a music store with its window lit warm against the night. Inside, a little girl stood on tiptoe, pressing a single key on a display piano. Her mother watched, smiling. Leora stopped and watched too, just for a moment. She didn't need to be on a stage to know her music mattered. It was in the way a stranger's eyes softened, in the way a child's fingers reached for sound, in the way her father's hand still found hers, even when words were gone. Back at her apartment, she opened her journal, the one Darian had given her, and wrote a new line at the top of a fresh page. "Music isn't something you own, It's something you pass on. She didn't know if she'd ever play for thousands. She didn't care. What mattered was that somewhere right now, a kid was practicing a scale in a community center. A nurse was humming a melody on her break. An old man was tapping his foot to a memory. And in a quiet penthouse overlooking the lake, Darian sat alone in his library, the 47-second recording playing softly in the background. He didn't feel lonely anymore. He felt connected, to her, to the music, to the quiet ripple of something real. Leora never became a household name. No headlines, no red carpets, no viral fame. But in the lives she touched gently, consistently, without fanfare, she left something far more lasting than applause. She left the sound of someone being seen. And sometimes, late at night, when the city finally slept and the only sound was the wind through the trees, she'd sit at her window, listen to the silence, and smile. Because even in the quiet, the music never really stopped.